Northern Minnesota, 1879. The thermometer nailed to the cabin door read 45 below zero, and across the settlement, families were burning chair legs to keep their stoves alive. But inside one small cabin set against a stand of birch trees, 3 children slept in cotton shirts and stockinged feet, their cheeks flushed pink with warmth, while their mother sat at the kitchen table mending a wool sock by the steady light of a single tallow candle. She wasn't bundled. She wasn't shivering. She was working in shirt sleeves, her bare forearms resting on a table that felt almost warm to the touch. Aila Korhonen, the Finnish widow whose neighbors had spent 6 months calling her a fool, was watching the worst night any of them had ever lived through, and her cabin was the only one in the township where children weren't crying from the cold. A quarter-mile south, the Bergstrom family was burning the rails of their handmade dining chairs, having already fed the stove every loose board they could pry from their floor. A mile north, the Whitfields were huddled together on a single mattress dragged close to the fireplace, breathing through wool scarves while frost crept up the inside of their windows. The Donovan place had gone dark hours ago, and nobody knew yet whether the family was alive or dead inside. But Aila's cabin held a steady 64 degrees, and her 3 children, Mira, who was 11, Toivo, who was 8, and little Kaisa, who had just turned 5, slept the deep, untroubled sleep of children who had never once in their lives been cold indoors. The walls of that cabin held no special magic. They held birch-bark, dried sphagnum moss, and compressed wool scraps, packed in layers between log and lath by a stubborn Finnish widow who had refused to listen when every neighbor and every well-meaning man in the territory told her she was building wrong. What did Aila Korhonen understand about wind, vapor, and the slow stillness of trapped air that the rest of the township had dismissed as the muttered superstition of an immigrant who didn't know how proper American homesteads were built? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering, and if you'd be so kind, leave a comment with your city and the time of day where you're watching from. We love seeing where these stories travel. Aila had come to the territory in the spring of 1878 with 3 children, 2 trunks, a wedding quilt that still smelled faintly of her mother's cedar chest, and a husband whose lungs had already begun to fail him on the long crossing from Hanko. Mikko Korhonen had been a strong man once, a timber cutter from the forests outside Kuopio, with shoulders broad enough to carry a felled spruce on his own. But the damp passage through the North Atlantic had settled into his chest like wet ash, and by the time the family reached the rail terminus at Duluth, he was coughing blood into a handkerchief he tried to keep his children from seeing. He lived long enough to file the homestead claim, long enough to walk the boundary stakes with Aila and tell her where the cabin should sit so that the morning sun would warm the front door, long enough to show his oldest son how to swing an axe with the grain of the wood instead of against it. He died on a Tuesday in late September, with the last of the maples turning copper outside the half-finished cabin, and Aila buried him beneath a young birch tree on the southwest corner of the claim, because birch had been the tree of her grandmother's village, and she wanted him to rest under something that reminded her of home. The neighbors had been kind in those first weeks, in the way that frontier communities knew how to be kind. The men had come and helped raise the rest of the cabin walls before the snow arrived. The women had brought bread and salt pork and a quart of plum preserves still warm from the kettle. But kindness in the territories had a short half-life, and by the time the second winter approached, Aila Korhonen had become something else entirely in the eyes of her neighbors. She had become the strange Finnish widow with the unmarried way of doing things, the woman who turned down offers of help that came tied to suggestions about how she ought to remarry, the immigrant who answered every piece of well-meant advice with a quiet thank you, and then went on doing exactly as her own judgment told her. The first cabin Mikko had built before he died was a serviceable structure but a poorly insulated one, round logs stacked tight, daubed with red clay between the courses, a single window of mail-order glass facing south, and a stone chimney that drew well but bled heat through every crack the mortar had failed to seal. Aila had spent that first winter measuring how the cold moved through her walls. She put her hand against the logs at 3 in the morning when the children's breathing had grown slow with sleep, and she felt the cold radiating through wood thick enough that it should have stopped a rifle ball. She watched her breath fog inside the cabin, even with the stove glowing red, and she remembered her grandmother's house in Karelia, where the walls had been thicker than a man's forearm, and the air inside had stayed dry and quiet through every storm of her childhood. Her grandmother, Hilda Manella, had been a woman who knew how to make a household heat, the way a stone holds heat after the sun is gone. The Manila farmhouse had stood for 140 years on a windswept ridge above the Saimaya Lake country, built and rebuilt by women who passed their knowledge down in the kitchen rather than through any written record. Aila had spent the long winters of her childhood watching her grandmother work, asking the questions that small girls ask when they are bored and curious, and storing the answers away the way a magpie stores bright things against a future need. She remembered 3 things in particular as she sat through that first inadequate Minnesota winter and made her plans for the second one. She remembered the layers of birch bark her grandmother had peeled and pressed flat and tucked under the floorboards and behind the bed walls and around the chimney where it joined the roof. The bark, her grandmother had told her, did not warm the house. The bark stopped the wet from coming in and stopped the warm from going out. And a wall that stayed dry stayed warm, while a wall that took on damp turned into a thief that stole heat all winter long. She remembered the moss her grandmother had gathered every autumn from the bog behind the cow pasture, spreading it on the rocks to dry until it crumbled like old bread between your fingers, then stuffing it into linen sacks and pressing those sacks into every cavity in every wall before the snow came. The moss was nothing in itself, her grandmother had said, only a handful of dead green stuff that anybody could gather. But the moss held still air the way a cupped hand holds water, and still air was the only thing in the world that could stop cold from passing through a wall. And she remembered the wool, every scrap of wool that came through her grandmother's hands during the year, the ends snipped from the carding, the worn-out stockings beyond darning, the fleece pieces too short for the spinning wheel. Every scrap was washed and dried and saved in a wooden barrel beside the loom. When the time came to repack a wall or chink a sill, or stuff the dead space behind a chimney back, the wool came out of that barrel and went where it was needed. Wool, her grandmother had explained while her hands worked, did 3 things at once. It held the still air the way the moss did. It bent and packed into the smallest crack the way nothing else could. And it kept on doing both those things even when the weather drove damp into the wall, because wool would shed moisture without losing its loft the way no other material her people had ever found could match. 3 materials, 3 principles, all of them free for the taking off the land if you knew where to look and how to harvest them. Aila Korhonen, sitting at her kitchen table in the lengthening dusk of February, with 3 children asleep under every blanket she owned, made up her mind. She was going to insulate her cabin the way her grandmother had taught her, and she was not going to listen to a single word of advice from any neighbor who hadn't grown up in a house that stood for 140 years on a Karelian ridge. The work began in earnest the following May, as soon as the frost had let go of the topsoil and the birch trees had begun to stir with the first rising of sap. Aila walked her claim with her oldest daughter Mira beside her, marking the trees that would give her the bark she needed without dying of the harvest. Birch bark, Hilda Manella had taught her granddaughter, must be taken in midsummer when the sap is full but past its first rising, when the outer skin will lift cleanly away from the inner cambium, without tearing the living wood beneath. Take only from the trees that are already sound and large. Take only from the side that faces away from the prevailing wind, so the tree's wound has time to scar before winter, and take only as much as you need, because a birch peeled too greedily will turn to soft punk in 3 seasons and stand dead another 20 before falling. She made her first cuts in the 3rd week of June with a sharp knife and a steady hand, working the blade down the length of the trunk in a single careful slice, then easing the bark away in long curling sheets that came free with a sound like fabric tearing. The Donovan boy, Patrick, who was 16 and idle and given to following Aila's daughter Mira at a distance whenever he thought nobody was watching, came riding past the claim that afternoon and saw what she was doing. He went home and told his father, and the father told the men at the feed store, and within a week the whole township knew that the Finnish widow had taken to peeling trees like an Indian woman. Otto Bergstrom was the first to come and tell her she was doing it wrong. Otto was a Swedish man who had been in the territory since '68 and considered himself the practical conscience of the settlement. He arrived on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hand and his face arranged into the careful sympathy a man wears when he means to correct a widow's bad judgment without seeming to lecture her. "Mrs. Korhonen," he began, "I see you are stripping the birches behind the cabin. I want to be helpful to you, you understand? The bark of a birch is no good for chinking. You want red clay mixed with horsehair, like the men in this country use. The bark will rot inside your wall and bring mice and bring damp, and your logs will be soft inside of 3 years. Aila set down the strip of bark she was rolling and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Otto Bergstrom for a long moment before she answered. She had liked Otto well enough during the first weeks after Mikko's death, when he had come with his wife to bring a covered dish and sit on her porch in respectful silence. She had liked him less well in the months since, as it had become clear that his idea of helping a widow involved a great many opinions about what she ought to do, and very few offers of actual labor. My grandmother put birch bark in her walls, and the walls stood 140 years, Aila said quietly. I think they will stand long enough here, too. Otto's face tightened. He had not come to be argued with by a woman who barely cleared his shoulder. Your grandmother lived in Finland, Mrs. Korhonen. Finland is not Minnesota. The cold here is different. The wood is different. You cannot bring the old country across the ocean and put it in your walls and expect it to work. The cold is the same cold, Mr. Bergstrom. Cold is cold everywhere it goes. He left without saying goodbye, and the next Sunday at church, Aila felt the eyes of the other women lingering on her in a new way. The story of her stubbornness had begun to spread, and stubbornness in a young widow was not a quality the township was inclined to forgive. She kept working. Through July, she peeled bark from 43 birches across her claim, taking from each only what the tree could spare and rolling the sheets in tight bundles she stored in the woodshed where the air stayed dry. She showed Mira how to recognize the right trees and how to make the cuts, and how to ease the bark free without tearing it. And she showed Toivo how to flatten the rolled sheets under stones, so they would lie flat against a wall when the time came to tuck them in. By the first week of August, she had enough bark to line every exterior wall of the cabin from the sill to the eaves with 2 overlapping courses, and she had not killed a single tree in the doing. The moss came next, and the moss was a longer business. Sphagnum moss grows in the wet places where the prairie's eastern edge breaks against the great northern bog country, and gathering enough of it to insulate a cabin meant walking 3 miles to the cedar swamp behind the Olofsson claim, and walking back again with as much green wet weight as a woman could carry on a yoke across her shoulders. Aila made that walk twice a week through August and into September, sometimes with Mira beside her and sometimes alone, gathering the moss in burlap sacks and spreading it to dry on a wooden frame she had built behind the cabin, where the afternoon sun would do the slow work of pulling the water out of it. The Donovan children took to walking past the drying frame after school just to stare at the heaped green-going-gray mass of moss, like it was some heathen ritual being practiced in their township. The Whitfield boy threw a rock at it once when he thought nobody was looking, and Mira chased him a 1/4 mile down the road with a stick before her mother called her back. Word spread that the Finnish widow was filling her walls with bog scrapings, and the word came back to Aila in pieces through the women at the post office, through the half-overheard conversations at the general store, through the careful silence that fell over a knot of men whenever she walked past the smithy on her way to buy nails. Pastor Lindqvist himself rode out to the claim in late August, his black coat dusted with the chalky white of the section road, his hat held against his chest in a posture that suggested he had been rehearsing what he meant to say. "Oh, Sister Korhonen," he began, after she had given him water in a wooden chair on the porch. "Your neighbors are concerned. I am concerned. A widow alone with children must not give the township reason to question her judgment. The talk has become unkind. They are saying, you fill your house with the things of the wild instead of building it with the things of civilized men." Aila had liked Pastor Lindqvist well enough until that moment. He had buried Mikko with a Finnish hymn at her request, even though he himself was Swedish, and the small kindness had bound her to him in a way she had not realized until he sat on her porch and used his soft voice to tell her she was making a fool of herself. "Pastor," she said, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course, sister." "When my husband lay coughing in our cabin last winter, with the wind coming through, the chinking and the stove burning hot enough to crack the iron and the children waking up with frost on their hair, did any civilized man come to tell me how to make my walls hold heat?" He looked down at his hat. "I will tell you the truth, Pastor. They did not. They came when he was already dead, and they brought bread. The bread was kind, and I was grateful. But I do not need bread now. I need walls that will not let my children die when the winter comes harder than it came last year. And I have the knowledge to make those walls because my grandmother taught me. So I will use what I know, and I will let the township talk if it must. And on the night the cold comes hardest, we will see whose children sleep warm and whose children sleep cold." The pastor left without finishing his water. He did not come back. The wool was the third material, and the wool was the hardest of all to gather because Aila had no sheep and no money to buy fleece. And the only wool that came into her hands was what came worn out and used up from the lives of people who had no use for it anymore. She put the word out through the women at church that she would take any wool nobody wanted. Old stockings beyond darning, sweater scraps, the matted underbellies of carding work, even the dirty offcuts the Olafson women trimmed off their fleeces before spinning. Some of the women laughed at her. Some of them, the older ones who remembered their own grandmothers, brought her bundles wrapped in newspaper and would not take payment. Greta Korhonen, who was 68 and had come over from Oulu when she was a girl of 19, brought Aila a flour sack stuffed with 3 years of accumulated wool ends, and she sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched Aila's face while she talked. "Your grandmother's name?" she asked. "Herti Hilda Manela. Manela of the Saimaa country." "Yes," the old woman nodded slowly. "I knew of her. My mother spoke of the Manila women. They knew how to keep a house. You do well to remember her. Do not let these foolish Swedes talk you out of your own grandmother." Aila pressed her hand against the older woman's hand and did not trust herself to speak. By the first week of October, she had enough material to begin. The cabin Mikko had built her measured 14 feet by 20, with walls of round pine logs 8 inches in diameter and a peaked roof of split cedar shake. She did not tear it down. She did not rebuild it. What she did instead was build a second wall inside the first, working from the inside out the way her grandmother had described it, creating a cavity of 3.5 inches between the original logs and the new inner skin, and packing that cavity with the material she had spent half a year gathering. The inner skin was made of rough sawn boards she had bartered from the Olafson sawmill in exchange for 2 months of her best needlework. She nailed those boards horizontally to a frame of 2 by 3 studs, set 3.5 inches inside the existing logs, working her way around the entire cabin a few feet at a time, packing the cavity behind each section before she sealed it with the next board. Mira held the boards while Aila nailed them. Toivo carried bundles of moss and bark and wool from the woodshed to the work area. Even little Kaisa had a job, which was to sit on a stool and count the nails into a tin cup and pass them up to her mother one at a time when called for. The packing went in 3 layers, and the order of the layers mattered as much as the materials themselves. Closest to the outer logs, against the cold side of the wall, Aila pressed in a continuous course of birch bark, 2 sheets thick, with every seam overlapped by the width of a man's hand. The bark went in shiny side toward the cold, dull side toward the warm, and it served the same purpose as her grandmother's bark had served on the Karelian ridge. It was a vapor barrier. It stopped the warm, wet breath of the family inside from passing through the wall and meeting the cold logs on the other side, where it would condense into ice and rot the wood from within. Every house in the township had this problem, though none of the men who built those houses understood what was causing the rot they blamed on bad timber and poor luck. Behind the bark, filling the bulk of the cavity, went the moss. Aila packed it in by hand, working it loose between her fingers until it had the springy give of a feather pillow, then pressing it into the space until it would hold its shape without falling. Not too tight, her grandmother had told her. Tight moss is dead moss. The air must move inside it just barely, just enough to fill the empty places between the dry stems, but never enough to circulate and steal heat from the house. She packed it to about 3 pounds per cubic foot, judged by feel rather than measurement, and she left no voids and no settling pockets where cold could collect. The wool went last, packed into the inner 3/4 of an inch closest to the new board skin, providing the final thermal barrier and also doing the work of compressing the moss behind it, so that nothing would settle through a winter of frost heave and thaw. She stuffed the wool tight, tighter than the moss, packing it with a wooden mallet and a flat tamping stick she had carved for the purpose, and she made sure every cavity behind every board was completely filled before she drove the next nail. The work took her 6 weeks. She worked through October while the leaves came down in red and yellow showers around the cabin, and she worked into November while the first hard frosts made the boards stiff and the moss harder to compress. Her hands cracked and bled. Her back ached. Mira learned to nail almost as well as her mother did, and Toivo learned to run a hand plane along a rough board to smooth it for fitting. Little Kaisa stopped counting nails after the 3rd week and started instead to recite, in a small, grave voice, the Finnish words her mother taught her for the things they were doing. Tuohi for bark, Samel for moss, Villa for wool. So the words would not die in her mouth the way they had begun to die in the mouths of every other Finnish child in the territory. The neighbors came past and looked and shook their heads. Otto Bergstrom rode by on his way to town one afternoon and stopped his wagon long enough to call out, "You're making the cabin smaller, Mrs. Korhonen. You're losing 3 inches of room on every wall. By the time you're done, you'll be living in a closet." 3 inches, Aila answered without looking up from her hammering, is the difference between a wall that holds heat and a wall that does not. I will live in a smaller room and be warm. You may have your bigger room and be cold. He drove on without answering. The window casings and door frames required special attention because every opening in a wall is a place where heat tries to escape, and where the joining of materials creates the chance for gaps. Aila lined every window opening with 3 overlapping courses of birch bark, packed wool tight around the casing, and finished the inside with a strip of wool felt nailed under a thin trim board so the seal between glass and wall was complete. The door got the same treatment, plus an additional curtain of heavy wool blankets she could pull across the threshold at night to break the draft that always crept under the bottom edge. The chimney was the trickiest part. The stovepipe of her small cast-iron heating stove rose through the ceiling and out the roof, and the place where it passed through the roof boards was a constant source of heat loss in every cabin in the township. Aila built a wooden box around the pipe with a 2-inch clearance on every side, and she packed that box not with moss or wool, both of which would have been a fire hazard, but with a tight-packed core of wood ash, which her grandmother had taught her was both fireproof and a respectable insulator on its own. The wood ash she had been saving from her cooking fire for months, and she had a full keg of it ready when the time came. When the inside walls were complete, Aila turned her attention to the floor and the ceiling, because her grandmother had taught her that a wall by itself was useless if the floor below and the loft above were leaking heat in their own right. She pulled up the existing floorboards, laid down a continuous sheet of birch bark over the rough joists, packed the joist cavities with a 6-inch deep layer of dry moss covered by a finishing layer of wool, and then nailed the floor back down over the top. She did the same in reverse for the ceiling, climbing into the loft space and packing every cavity between the rafters with moss to a depth of nearly a foot, then laying birch bark over the top so any moisture that found its way up there would not work its way back down into the insulation. By the 2nd week of November, with the first real snow already on the ground, and her woodpile stacked higher than her own head, Aila Korhonen had finished. She stood in the middle of her newly insulated cabin and looked at the wall she had built and thought of her grandmother. Dead now, 22 years in a churchyard outside Mikkeli. And she thought of Mikko under the birch tree on the southwest corner of the claim, and she said quietly, in Finnish, "I have done what I could. We will see now what kind of wall it is." The first cold snap arrived on the 15th of November and brought an opportunity to test her work without the desperation of life or death pressing on it. Temperatures fell to 12 below zero with a steady wind out of the northwest, and Aila banked her stove low for the night just to see how the cabin would hold heat without constant feeding. She filled the stove with seasoned oak at 9 in the evening, closed the damper to a slow burn, and went to bed in her usual flannel nightdress without piling extra quilts on the children. She woke at 4 in the morning by habit, the way mothers wake, and she put her feet on the floor expecting the shock of cold boards against her skin. The boards were cool, but they were not cold. They were the temperature of a piece of metal that has been sitting in a heated room for an hour, somewhere around 55 degrees, which was a temperature she had not felt under her bare feet at 4 in the morning during any previous winter of her life on the Minnesota frontier. She walked to the stove and opened the damper and added one piece of oak. She walked to the thermometer she had hung on the inside wall near the door and read the temperature. 61 degrees. Outside, the same thermometer's twin she had hung on the porch read 14 below. A difference of 75 degrees between inside and outside, with a stove that had been damped down to coals for 7 hours. She allowed herself to smile for the first time since Miko had died. By the end of November, she had begun a pattern she would maintain through the entire winter. Every morning at dawn she recorded the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, the wind, the amount of wood she had burned the previous 24 hours. She kept the records in a small leather-bound book Miko had bought her in Duluth for keeping household accounts, and she filled the pages with neat columns of numbers that meant nothing to anyone else, but that told her, day by day, exactly how her cabin was performing against the deepening winter. The numbers were extraordinary. On nights when the outside temperature fell to 20 below, her cabin held 62 degrees with no more than 4 small loads of wood. The Bergstroms 200 yards down the road were going through a quarter cord of split oak every 24 hours and complaining at church that their interior temperatures barely reached 50 by supper time. The Whitfields were burning even more and reporting that their water bucket inside the cabin froze a half-inch thick by morning despite the stove running all night. Aila's water bucket, sitting 4 feet from her own stove, never developed so much as a skin of ice. Word of these differences began to leak into the township despite Aila's careful avoidance of any sentence that could be heard as boasting. The children were the messengers. Mira, going to the schoolhouse 3 mornings a week, would arrive in nothing more than her wool coat and a knit cap, while the other children stumbled in, wrapped in 3 layers of shawls and scarves that they took 20 minutes to peel off. Toivo, helping his mother at the general store, was overheard telling the storekeeper's son that he slept without a nightcap because the loft was too warm for one. Even little Kaisa, on a visit to the Olafson cabin where she went to play with the youngest Olafson girl, had startled the Olafson mother by asking, without any malice, why their cabin was so cold inside. The questions began to come, hesitant at first, then more frequent. Greta Korhonen asked Aila to describe the moss again, exactly how she had dried it, exactly how much she had used. Mrs. Olafson wanted to know whether birch bark really stopped the wet from coming through because her own logs had been turning soft on the north side, and she could not understand why. Even Otto Bergstrom's wife, Inga, came one Saturday in December with a basket of preserves she did not need to bring, and she sat on Aila's porch and looked at the cabin walls with an expression that was no longer mockery but something closer to bewilderment. "Otto says it cannot work," Inga said quietly. "He says you are lying about how much wood you burn." "Mrs. Bergstrom," Aila said, "I have a record book. Would you like to see it? You may compare my numbers to your own. I will not be offended." Inga did not look at the book. She looked at her hands instead, and she said, after a long silence, "I am cold all the time, Aila. I have been cold for 9 years in this country. Otto says it is the way a Minnesota winter must feel. But you do not look cold. I am not cold." "How?" And Aila told her. She told her about the bark and the moss and the wool and the layers in their proper order and the thermometer readings she had been keeping since November. In the 8 winters her grandmother had insulated her own house in Karelia using the same materials and the same methods. She talked for an hour while Inga Bergstrom listened without interrupting once, and when Aila had finished, Inga stood up and put on her coat and said, "Thank you. I will not tell Otto we had this conversation." She did not tell him, but Aila noticed that Inga's house, The next time she walked past it had a fresh stack of birch logs piled beside the porch that had not been there before, and that Inga was peeling some of them in a slow, careful way that suggested she had been told how it should be done. The killing cold arrived on the 20th of January, 1880, and it announced itself 2 days in advance through the sky and the wind and the strange silence of the prairie animals. Aila woke that morning to find the air so still she could hear the creak of the ice forming on the small creek behind the cabin. The sky overhead was a hard, polished blue that meant, in the language her grandmother had taught her to read, that something terrible was coming down from the north, and that the time to prepare for it was now. She sent Toivo out to bring in 3 days of firewood and stack it inside the kitchen against the inner wall. She had Mira fill every container in the cabin with water from the well, so they would not have to make a trip outside if the weather turned worse than she expected. She baked a double batch of rye bread and salted 3 pounds of pork into a stoneware crock and made certain every wool blanket in the house was folded and within reach of the children's beds. The cold came in the evening of the 22nd. The temperature dropped from 12 below at sundown to 26 below by 10 in the evening, and the wind that had been still all day rose suddenly out of the northwest with a sound like a thrown stone hitting a frozen pond. Aila listened to it through the new walls of her cabin and heard, instead of the howling and the rattling she had heard in every previous winter, only a faint distant moaning that might have been the wind, or might have been a far-off train, or might have been nothing at all. The wall held. The wall did not let the wind in. By midnight, the thermometer outside her door read 38 below. By 2 in the morning, it read 42 below. By the hour just before dawn, when Aila rose to feed the stove and check the children, the thermometer had reached 45 below zero, and the wind was driving snow across the prairie in horizontal sheets, so thick that her own woodshed 20 feet from the back door had vanished entirely from view. Inside the cabin, the temperature was 64 degrees. She walked from bed to bed, checking the children. Mira slept on her side with one arm flung over her younger brother, her mouth slightly open, her cheeks pink. Toivo lay on his back with his stocking feet sticking out from under the quilt, and Aila gently tucked them back under without waking him. Little Kaisa, in the small alcove bed Aila had built for her against the warmest inner wall, slept curled around a rag doll with her cotton nightgown pushed up around her knees. None of them was wearing a nightcap. None of them was bundled in anything more than the same night clothes they wore in October. All 3 of them were warm to the touch when Aila pressed the back of her hand against their foreheads, and none of them stirred when she pulled the curtain closed again behind their beds. She built up the stove with 3 pieces of oak, sat down at the kitchen table, picked up a wool sock that had developed a small hole in the heel, threaded a darning needle and began to mend. It was the deepest cold any of them had ever known, and her cabin held it off as if it were no more than an autumn drizzle. The first knock came at 4:30 in the morning. It was a faint, hesitant sound, the kind of knock a person makes when they are not sure whether they have the right to knock at all. Aila set down the sock and went to the door and lifted the heavy wool curtain aside and pulled the door open. Patrick Donovan stood on her porch. He was 16 years old and 3/4 frozen. His coat was rimed white with frost, and his eyebrows were rimed white with frost, and his lips had gone the color of the gray sky in February. Behind him on the snow, half pulled from a small hand sled, were 2 younger children wrapped in what looked like everything the family had owned, and behind them stood Patrick's mother, Eileen Donovan, holding a bundle that Aila realized after a long horrified second was a baby. "My father," Patrick said through teeth that had locked together with cold. "My father is dead, Mrs. Korhonen. He went out for wood and he did not come back, and we found him this morning in the woodshed. The fire is out. The children are cold. We did not know where to go. We did not know if you would—" "Come in," Aila said. "Come in. All of you. Now. Right now." She got them inside. She got the door shut. She got the wool curtain back across it. She took the baby from Eileen Donovan's arms and felt the small body and was relieved beyond words that the child was still warm beneath the wrappings. She put the baby into the bed alongside little Kaisa, who woke just enough to look at the new arrival and then went back to sleep with one small hand resting on the baby's blanket. She got the two middle Donovan children, who were 6 and 9, settled on the rag rug in front of the stove with quilts pulled up around them. She got Patrick out of his frozen coat and into a chair at the kitchen table, and she put a cup of hot coffee into his hands and watched him weep silently into it, without the strength to wipe his own face. Eileen Donovan stood in the middle of the cabin with snow melting off her boots and a look on her face that was not yet grief because grief had not caught up to her yet. It was only confusion, the slow, uncomprehending blink of a woman who did not understand why this cabin was so warm when her own had been a tomb, who did not understand why her husband was dead and her children were not, who did not understand any of it. "Sit down, Mrs. Donovan," Aila said quietly. "Sit down here by the stove. I will bring you something hot. We will talk about your husband when there is time. Right now, we will get you warm." Eileen sat. Aila brought coffee. Eileen drank it and began to shiver, which Aila knew was a good sign because shivering meant the body had recognized it was warm enough to start working again. Within an hour, Eileen was no longer shivering, and within 2 hours she was asleep on the rag rug with her arms around her two middle children and her head on a pillow Aila had pulled from her own bed. The second knock came at 6 in the morning. It was Inga Bergstrom, with Otto behind her and their 3 half-grown sons trailing after. Otto's face had aged a decade overnight. He could not meet Aila's eyes when she opened the door. "Inga said you would take us in," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I told her we would not impose. But the stove cracked an hour ago, and the cabin will not heat. I do not know where else to go. Bring them inside, Mr. Bergstrom." He brought them inside. The Bergstrom boys, who ranged in age from 11 to 15, were stiff with cold and silent, in the way boys go silent when they have been frightened past the point of bravado. Inga's hands were shaking too hard to unbutton her own coat, and Aila helped her with it the way she would have helped Kaisa. By 8 in the morning, the Whitfield family had arrived, and so had old Greta Korhonen, who lived alone half a mile to the east and had walked through 45 below wind chill on snowshoes with nothing more than determination keeping her upright. By 10 in the morning, the Olafsons were there, all 6 of them. By noon, the cabin held 19 souls. Aila had built the cabin for 4. It now held 19, and it held them at 62 degrees while the wind outside ran the thermometer past 46 below. She did not panic. She did not boast. She did what her grandmother would have done. She made a great pot of barley soup with salt pork and dried turnips. She set the older children to fetching wood from the inside stack. She put Greta Korhonen at the kitchen table with a darning needle and a basket of mending so the old woman would feel useful. She found a corner for everyone and a place to sit for everyone. And she kept the stove fed at a steady, moderate burn that did not waste wood, because she understood that the cabin's walls were doing most of the work, and the stove was only there to add what the walls could not hold on their own. Otto Bergstrom sat at the table across from his wife and across from Aila, and he watched her move through the crowded room with the calm of a woman who had already seen worse than this and lived through it. After an hour, he said very quietly, "Mrs. Korhonen." "Yes, Mr. Bergstrom." "I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing." "I owe you an apology. I told my wife you were a fool. I told the men at the feed store you were a fool. My boys repeated it at school. My boys would be dead now if you had been a fool." Aila looked at him for a long moment. She thought about saying many things. She thought about her grandmother, about Mikko, about the long, lonely months of being told she was wrong by men who would not bring a hammer to help her be right. She thought about all the cold and exhausting ways she could correct the record that Otto Bergstrom had built against her in his head and in the heads of his neighbors over the past 6 months. In the end, she said only, "We are alive. That is what matters today. Tomorrow we will talk about walls." He nodded and looked down at his hands. The storm raged for 3 more days and 3 more nights. The temperature did not climb above 30 below at any point during that stretch. The wind ran sustained at 30 miles an hour, with gusts that bent the chimney pipe on Aila's roof half an inch off, true, and rattled the window glass in its casings. 2 more families arrived during the second day, having heard from someone passing on the road that the Korhonen cabin was open. By the time the storm broke on the morning of the 26th, 27 people had taken refuge inside Aila's 14 by 20 cabin, and not one of them had taken sick, and not one of them had developed frostbite, and not one of them had been any colder than uncomfortably crowded for the duration. When the wind finally died and the sun came up clean and pale over a prairie that had been transformed into a polished white wasteland, the men went out to assess the damage. Tom Donovan was buried where he had fallen in the woodshed, frozen too solid to move until the spring thaw. 2 miles east, the McAllister family had survived only by burning every piece of furniture they owned. 3 miles north, the Hawkins place was found empty, with the family having walked out 2 days earlier and made it as far as the section road before being picked up half dead by a passing freight team. Across the township as a whole, 6 people had died. Tom Donovan, an elderly man named Ezra Pratt, who lived alone, and 4 small children in 3 different families. Inside Aila's cabin, no one had died, and no one had even come close. The aftermath was a slow and complicated thing. Otto Bergstrom became Aila's strangest advocate. The man who had spent the previous summer telling everyone in the township that the Finnish widow was a fool now spent the rest of the winter telling everyone that she was the only person in the territory who knew how to build a wall. He took apart his own cabin in pieces over the next 2 springs, working through Aila's methods step by step under her quiet direction, and by the spring of 1882, his house held heat better than any other house in the township except in Aila's own. The Whitfields followed. The Olofsons followed. Greta Korhonen helped where she could, translating between the older Finnish women and the Swedish and Irish women who wanted to learn but could not always understand the technical terms when they came in Aila's accented English. The cabin Aila had built for her family became, for a stretch of 2 or 3 years, a kind of school, with women coming in the late afternoon to watch her demonstrate the proper way to roll birch bark, or pack moss, or compress wool into a wall cavity, and then going home to do the same to their own walls. The men were slower to come to her, but they came eventually. Otto Bergstrom brought his oldest son to learn from Aila in the spring of '81, and the boy in turn taught his own children 15 years later when he built his own homestead. The methods spread along the network of immigrant connections that bound the upper Midwest together in those years, traveling north into the Iron Range and west into the Dakotas and east into Wisconsin, carried by women who had heard about the Finnish widow, whose cabin had stayed warm on the night the world froze. Aila herself never wrote any of it down in a way that survived. She kept her record book through 3 more winters, then stopped keeping it because the methods had become so routine that the numbers no longer surprised her. She raised her 3 children to adulthood in the cabin, and she watched Mira marry a Norwegian boy from the next county over, and Toivo go off to the lumber camps of the Iron Range, and little Kaisa become a school teacher in Duluth. She lived in the cabin alone for the last 11 years of her life, dying in her sleep in the winter of 1903 at the age of 68, in a house that still held its heat the way she had taught it to. What Aila Korhonen had understood, and what the township had needed a killing winter to learn, was that warmth was not generated. Warmth was held, Every house on the frontier was producing roughly the same amount of heat from roughly the same kind of stove. The difference between a warm house and a cold one had nothing to do with how hard the stove worked. It had to do with how well the walls refused to let the heat go. Birch bark stopped vapor, moss held still air, wool packed tight into the smallest spaces, and would not lose its loft when the damp of a long winter found its way into a wall. Layered together, in the order her grandmother had taught her, they did the work of insulation more effectively than any commercial product available in the territory in the year 1879, and they did it for free, with materials any homesteader could gather off the land if they knew how to look. The science behind it was simple, and would be confirmed in detail by building physicists half a century later. Heat moves through a wall by three mechanisms: conduction through the solid material, convection through the moving air inside any cavity, and radiation across any surface that faces a colder one. A single log wall fights only the first of those mechanisms, and it does so badly. A wall packed with fibrous insulation fights all three. The fibers themselves conduct heat poorly. The spaces between the fibers are too small for air to circulate, so convection is suppressed, and the layered surfaces of bark and wool reflect radiant heat back toward the warm side of the wall instead of letting it pass through. Aila's grandmother had not known any of this in the technical language of physics. She had known it in the language of a woman who had watched her own grandmother before her. Generations of accumulated observation and refinement, passed down in kitchens and behind looms, surviving across an ocean and a continent in the head of a Finnish widow who had refused to let her grandmother's knowledge die just because the men of her new township had decided it was foreign nonsense. The legacy of that night in January 1880 was carried forward in walls in dozens of cabins across the township that survived into the 20th century, with their interiors still warm and their structural logs still sound, while neighboring cabins built without insulation rotted from the inside and were torn down. Walls in the houses that the Bergstrom and Whitfield and Olofsson grandchildren built in the next generation, where the methods Aila had taught had become simply the way one built a house in that part of the country, the rationale for which had been forgotten even as the practice continued. Walls in some of the structures that still stand today on the back roads of central Minnesota, structures whose owners do not always know why they are warm, but who would discover if they ever opened up the cavity behind the boards. Layers of moss and bark and wool packed by the careful hands of women who had learned from women who had learned from a Finnish widow who would not be told how to insulate her cabin. On the night the temperature fell to 45 below zero, in a township where 6 people died of the cold, 3 children slept in cotton shirts and stockinged feet, on a bed warmed by walls their mother had built with her own hands, using the wisdom of a grandmother dead 22 years in a churchyard outside McKelly. They slept, and they did not wake, and they did not even know how close the world outside their walls had come to killing them. That was the gift Aila Korhonen had given them. That was the gift she had refused to let the township talk her out of giving. And on every frontier where winter has tried to take what families have built against its fury, the lesson she proved that night has held true, that the difference between life and death, between a warm child and a frozen one, is not the size of the stove or the strength of the man who tends it. It is the patience of the woman who packed the wall, and the knowledge she carried across an ocean to put inside it, and the stubbornness with which she refused, in the face of every neighbor's mockery, to build her house any way other than the way her grandmother had taught her. If this story of practical wisdom and quiet stubbornness moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have many more documented accounts of frontier ingenuity worth remembering, and your subscription helps us continue to bring these stories back into the light. Drop a comment below telling us your city and what time it is where you're watching from. We genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel and where they find their audience. Thank you for watching, and may your own walls hold warm against whatever winters come.